It was started for political reasons. Some believe that you shouldn't go to hospital because if you go to hospital, they give you injections to kill you. That sort of paranoia and mistrust, those kinds of beliefs are much more common in societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor. And they make the sort of work that Larry was telling us about so much harder. I'm going to talk about inequality and what it does to our societies. I like to show this slide first because it shows how miserable we all are. This is people in the prime of life, a photograph taken in London. Every face there is depressed and anxious. And what I have to say about inequality, I think is relevant to the ways in which our societies are very bad at producing well-being. In the rich world now, thinking of the environmental effects of economic growth, it's not economic growth we want, it's growth in well-being we want. And that isn't the same story. I've written this much too small, so you can't read it. I have a copy of it in much larger print that I will read you. It comes from a study of poverty in different countries, rich and poor countries, where poverty means quite different things. It's an international team interviewed people in poverty in Uganda, in India, in China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom and Norway. In India, poverty means living in a little shack with an earth floor, no cooking facilities indoors, you cook outdoors, no water supply, no sewerage. In Norway, living in poverty means living in a 3-bedroom house with central heating and a flat-screen television. So it means totally different things in material terms in each society. But the experience of poverty, which they were getting in these interviews, was extraordinarily similar. An anthropologist I enormously admire in the United States, Marshall Salins, once said that poverty is not a certain small amount of goods. Poverty is an invidious distinction between social classes. And you're going to see how much of that is true in this study of people's experience of poverty in those very different countries. They say respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. No parent was able to escape the shame of failing to provide for their children, even when children were prepared to stop asking for things, the latter itself being a further source of shame. For men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father of 2 children admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm the man in this relationship. I'm meant to be the man, to take care of the missus and my kids, and I don't." What I read that to you the point I wanted to make is that it's about low social status. Of course, there are direct effects of low material standards. In poorer countries, we need economic growth. But there is also this extraordinary sensitivity to social status differentiation, superiority and inferiority. I sometimes say that there is a naive view of inequality, that it only matters if it creates absolute poverty, or if it's seen as very unfair. But actually, inequality, what it does is create feelings of superiority and inferiority. It makes us judge each other more by status. It makes us all more worried about how we are seen and judged by others. I'm going to take you through some of that data. The sort of work we've done, I started off working on health inequalities, the big social class differences in life expectancy between rich and poor that exist in every country. We were very much helped by studies of non-human primates. On the left there you see Carol Shively, who studied macaques in captivity, where she could keep the animals in the same material conditions, give them the same food, so there were not material differences between dominant animals and subordinate animals. And she's pointing to the arteries of a subordinate macaque monkey. And on the left is the clear artery of one of the dominant animals. The effects of chronic stress on people in subordinate positions we find in the big Whitehall studies of civil servants in London, where there are threefold differences in death rates between people working together, senior and junior people working together in the same offices. Death rates 3 times as high as at the bottom as the top. And also the neuroendocrinologist Robert Sapolsky studying baboons in the wild. And we see again many of the same effects of social status differences on stress hormones and so on as we find in human beings. And one of the interesting patterns that was observed, this comes from the Whitehall study, it's showing you levels of fibrinogen, a blood clotting factor. If you get wounded by a dominant animal, you want your blood to clot fast. You know, your main risk if you're a subordinate animal is being attacked by a dominant. And if what you're seeing here along the bottom, you have this position in the office hierarchy. The most senior people are 1, the most junior are 6. And you see there are higher levels of fibrinogen, so the blood clots faster in the more in the junior civil servants. Their blood is behaving a bit as if they were going to be bitten by the dominant animals. So this is a stress response. And many of the things I wanted to show you are effects of chronic stress, which have effects that look rather like more rapid aging. Another way you can make, in a sense, just the same point is looking at data within and between countries. This shows you life expectancy on the vertical axis in relation to GDP per capita, where countries are in the long history of economic growth. And you see the rapid improvements in life expectancy in the early stages of economic growth, and then it levels out. So the rich countries, Portugal, UK, Norway and the United States at the extreme top right, it doesn't really make much difference how rich those rich countries are, whether they're getting $25,000 per capita or $45,000 per capita. We lose the relationship between life expectancy and health. That curve moves up over time. We go on having improvements in health, but it's unrelated to economic growth. Even if you look at changes over 10, 20 or 40 years, there's almost no relationship. But if you look within countries, sorry, this is just blowing up that last piece at the top right, just to emphasize there's absolutely no relationship between where countries are in the rich world in national income per head and life expectancy. It's not just there's no significant relationship, there's no suggestion of relationship. But within our countries, there are these extraordinary social gradients in health. This is British data. The poorest areas on the right with the low life expectancy, the richest areas on the left with the high life expectancy. You see, this isn't a difference between the poor and everyone else. We're all part of this picture of health inequalities. If you think of health inequalities and start thinking about the unemployed or the homeless, that makes a small contribution on the right-hand end. But you see, the people just below the top are doing less well. You need some quite different theory, a different understanding of how health inequalities work. It's about social status differentiation. But you see, there's this paradox. Income differences between our rich societies make no difference at all to life expectancy. But within our societies, we see these extraordinarily regular gradients. I'm sorry not to be able to show you the data for Portugal. I looked rather hard for it and didn't find it. But that paradox, that income between our countries doesn't matter and within our countries it's so important, tells us that we're looking at relative income or social position, where we are in relation to each other. It's about social status differentiation. The same reason why the experience of the poor in those very different material conditions in different countries was so similar. That sense of being at the bottom of failure. And as soon as you've got that idea that it's about the differences between us, you must start asking what happens when we make the differences between us bigger or smaller. And that's what I can show you. The data we used, simply because it's easy to understand, downloaded from the UN Human Development Report, is how much richer the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%. How big is that gap? And you see on the left, the more equal countries, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. The richest 20% are getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20%. But on the right here, Singapore, USA, Portugal, UK, the gap is twice as big. And that allows us to start seeing what inequality does. And actually, the old intuition that's been around since, I suppose, the French Revolution, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive, that intuition we now see is truer than we ever realized. I should say that when we collected this data in the early 2000s, Portugal was then more unequal than it is. Its inequality has been coming down a bit, whereas in many other countries it's been going up. So your position is a little better than I'm showing it on the graphs that follow. Basically, what I'm going to show you again and again is this graph with different problems on the vertical axis. You've got income inequality along the bottom. I found this on Google Images, and I thought, wow, somebody's understood. I didn't draw this graph, but it's the best summary of what I have to say. What we did was collect internationally comparable data for the rich developed countries on life expectancy, on children's maths and literacy scores, on infant mortality, on homicide or murder rates in each country, imprisonment, that's the proportion of the population imprisoned in each country, teenage birth rates, how much people feel they can trust others, obesity, and figures on mental illness which includes drug and alcohol addiction. That's part of the standard psychiatric classification of mental illnesses, and some figures on social mobility. We didn't decide what figures are comparable, we just downloaded what WHO had or what OECD had for each of these. So if you don't like the data, don't blame us. Blame the international agencies that produce the data. And we put them together in one index, all weighted equally. So where a country is its sort of average performance on these outcomes. And you see the more unequal countries on the right, that measure of inequality I showed you in the rainbow stripes on the horizontal axis. USA, Portugal, UK, doing worst. And on the left, the more equal countries, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, all doing much better. It's an extraordinarily close relationship. We were worried that people would say that we'd looked at problems that suit our argument. So we also looked at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. It's an index that we had nothing to do with putting together. It contains 40 different components, so whether there's bullying in schools, what children's maths and literacy scores are like, what immunization rates are like, all those go into the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. And you see children doing worse in the more unequal countries on the right. This is the second index that UNICEF produced. The earlier index, we did a paper in the British Medical Journal showing the various components of it, all related strongly to inequality. And we looked at change between the first and the second index. And, of course, countries which had bigger rises in inequality had worsening child well-being scores. Sorry. This shows death rates for men of working age in the American states according to inequality. This time inequality, the more equal countries on the right with lower death rates. The red are Canadian provinces. You see, it's a powerful relationship. If you have bigger income differences, societies tend to have worse health. That age group, the relationships are strongest. But they exist in women. In old people, it looks as if you have to look at past experience rather than just at current levels of inequality. You can look at the cities in different countries, cities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Sweden, and the more equal ones on the right have lower mortality rates. These are teenage birth rates. Very big differences. You see at the bottom left there, in the more equal countries, you have about 5 teenage births per 1,000 women in their teens. Portugal has about 25. We in Britain have about 6 times that level in the most equal countries. The United States has 10 times that level. Huge differences in outcomes related to inequality. This one is the proportion of the population in prison. It's a log scale up the side, otherwise that line would go up in a great curve, but Japan is at about 40 prisoners per 100,000 population, and it goes up to about 400 per 100,000 population. Tenfold differences in the proportion of the population locked up. That isn't mainly because of more crime. A small component is more crime. Most of it is more punitive sentencing, a harsher system, a harsher legal system. So you get sent to prison more easily and for longer in more unequal countries. I don't know whether that's because there's more fear up and down the social hierarchy, or less empathy, less trust, whatever. But you need to be thinking about things like that to explain this relationship. I mean, it's extraordinary that countries spend quite so much on imprisonment. There are some American states that spend more on imprisonment than on higher education. This one is mental illness. There are threefold differences here. At the bottom you have about 8% of the population with any mental illness in the year preceding the survey, and at the top it goes up to 3 times that level in the more unequal countries. It's not simply people going to hospital or diagnosed with mental illnesses, as that would be too affected by how you access medical care in each country. This data is based on diagnostic interviews on random samples of the population. So you're not asked, have you been diagnosed with depression? You're asked about your sleep patterns, about your feelings of self-worth, about your appetite, all sorts of questions like that, which are found to be diagnostic of mental illness. And this figures on social mobility. I like to show this because I think some people believe that the huge income differences in our societies that are bigger now than they were in the 1960s and 70s, they believe that somehow these income differences are fair if we can all find our appropriate level in society. The idea that if you work hard and you're clever, you move up. If you're not, and you don't work hard, you move down. But what this shows is that in the more unequal countries on the right, there's less social mobility. The measure of social mobility is intergenerational income mobility. So what they're asking is, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons, or doesn't fathers' income matter very much? I'm sorry it's not for mothers and daughters. The difficulty with doing that is that there's such big changes in women's economic activity rates, so the figures are for fathers and sons. And basically, if you live in a very unequal country, your father's income is very important to how you do. When we first did these analyses, we had just the rich developed countries, and the United States had one of the lower social mobilities, and we like to say, if you want to live the American dream, not just to dream it, you should go to Denmark at the top here with the highest social mobility. I think we're not looking at some entirely new influence on all these different outcomes. We all know that all these problems get worse in the poorest areas. There are social gradients in these problems. The lower down the social ladder, the worse the outcomes, the worse the health, the worse the educational performance of school children, the more violence. What I think we're looking at is whether we had a very steep social pyramid in our societies like that, or a much shallower one like that. So we need to think of material differences between us as providing the foundation or the structure of the social pyramid in our societies. If you want a classless society, you have to reduce the material differences between us. Many people think it's bizarre to suggest that so many quite different problems are all driven by the scale of income differences in our society. You know, health has quite different social determinants from children's maths and literacy scores. Quite different determinants from imprisonment or violence. Yet what I think is happening is that problems which we know are related to social status within our societies, more common at the bottom of the social hierarchy, get worse when we increase the social status differences. Inequality makes class and status more powerful. In a way, you know, what I'm showing you is something that might seem extraordinarily obvious once you've got the picture. The only surprise is that inequality doesn't just affect the poor. I've been showing you sometimes threefold differences in the scale of mental illness or infant mortality, sometimes tenfold differences in other problems related to inequality. The differences are so big because it's not just the poor being affected. I told you that all of us were part of this pattern of health inequalities. I showed you that gradient right across English society, which when I was speaking in Madrid a couple of days ago, I showed them the Spanish data that had that same social gradient in health. You see it everywhere. But why those differences are so big is, as I say, because we're all being affected. Let me just give an illustration of how these problems affect all of us. These are children's maths and literacy scores, well, just literacy scores of young people. They're classified here by how many years of education their parents have had. So on the right you have young people with well-educated parents. Their parents have been to university. On the left you have young people whose parents have fewer years of education. So they're nearer the bottom of the social hierarchy. And what you see is that in the more unequal countries like the United States with bigger income differences, there is a steeper social gradient. In Sweden, with smaller income differences, a much shallower social gradient. The differences are biggest at the bottom of society on the left, but even near the top, it looks as if there is a small advantage in being in one of the more equal countries. Note that this is not telling you whether or not Sweden or the United States has more poor people. It's saying that wherever you are in the society, you do worse if the society has more of those big income divisions within it. We now know, I suppose, well, we put in our last book about 5 examples of this. We know about a dozen others, different outcomes, showing that the effects of inequality go way up the social scale. Colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health, using multi-level models, said that inequality acts as a general social pollutant because it moves so far up the scale. I just want to now give you a quick idea of the extraordinary influence that inequality has on the quality of social relations between us. There are lots of studies which show that we trust each other less in more unequal societies. And actually also studies that show that after levels of inequality rise, trust goes down. If you look at measures of involvement in community life, strength of community life, whether people belong to civic associations and voluntary groups, all that is weaker in more unequal societies. There are also studies which show that people help each other less in more unequal societies. A study of European countries show that if people in more unequal societies are less willing to help their neighbours. They help the disabled less, old people less. So you lose that trust, you lose the mutuality and reciprocity. You also see violence rising. This is an extraordinarily well-established relationship. There have been studies of the relationship between violence and inequality all around the world. There are probably 60 studies in the peer-reviewed journals showing this relationship. The red dots are American states and the blue triangles are Canadian provinces, and you see almost tenfold differences in homicide rates closely related to inequality. And people who suggested that maybe this is not due to inequality, it's due to ethnic mix, racism and things like that. These researchers looked at white murderers and inequality just amongst whites, and they found almost exactly the same relationship. If you look at some of the really more unequal societies, the most unequal societies, I was giving some lectures in Mexico and I took this photograph. Society is much more unequal than the United States or Britain or Portugal. You find not only have they lost that trust and the higher levels of violence, but they're actually frightened of each other. They barricade their houses with these fences and rolls of razor wire around the top and bars on their windows. And you see the same in South Africa, again, where there are huge levels of inequality. Those wires across the top, the horizontal lines, that's an electric fence. And the notice says, armed response. So if you're seen climbing in, you might get shot. So you move from societies with low inequality and a great sense of community life, trust, reciprocity, mutuality, to societies with lower levels of trust, more violence, and then to societies where we are frightened of each other and defend ourselves against each other. One more indication of that is this graph, which comes from two American economists. They published this graph in the New York Times. It shows the proportion of the population in what they call guard labor. By guard labor they mean security staff, police, prison staff, people like that. And as you see, the more unequal countries, a higher proportion of their labor force is involved in protecting us against each other. And they show that as the United States inequality has increased, so has the proportion of the labor force involved in guard labor. I've been showing you very simple bivariate graphs, not controlling for anything, though I did show you GNP per capita no longer matters in these rich developed countries. But there are probably 300 or 400 papers in the peer-reviewed literature looking at using much more sophisticated methods, multi-level models where you control for everyone's individual income or education, and then see if there are additional contextual effects of inequality affecting health or violence. People have control for lots of different things. What we have done is just try and make this picture accessible to the general public by showing the simplest graphs. We were told by our publisher that if you put an equation in a book, you lose 10,000 readers. So we don't even have the numbers on the graph, we just put high and low. We also know something about the time lags between quality and the worsening of these outcomes. These things are not just processes that happen in the rich world, we also see it in poorer countries. There are some studies with 100 different countries in them. But look, here you have infant mortality rates, and they come plunging down in the early stages of economic growth, and then it flattens out. The top blue line is infant mortality in the more unequal countries, and the bottom green line is infant mortality in the more equal countries. Inequality matters at all levels of economic growth. The only difference is that in poorer countries you still need economic growth. I'm going to say just a few words about what's going on behind this data. I find you have to hit people with the data before they will start to think what's going on behind it. The big change in our understanding of the big health inequalities in different countries is how important psychosocial factors are. As I said, the biological effects of chronic stress, which look rather like more rapid aging. Issues to do with low social status, weak social connections, that means not being involved in community life, having few friendships, poor relationships with people, all that is damaging to health. Friendship is extraordinarily protective of health. There's a meta-analysis of 150 studies which says that whether or not you have friends is at least as important as whether or not you smoke to your survival in a follow-up period. And the other factor is stress in early life, which casts a long fat shadow forwards. You know, when you get to my age, your health is partly affected by what happened to you in both before you were born, in pregnancy, and in early childhood. But look, these things are not quite separate factors. The insecurities, anxieties, feelings of low self-worth, not being valued, that go with low social status, are rather like the insecurities and anxieties and feeling that you're not valued that might come from a difficult early childhood. And friendship fits into that pattern, because if you have friends, they're people who value you. They enjoy your company. But if you feel people don't invite you to things, they choose not to sit next to you, you're excluded, we all know those self-doubts. We start to worry. Are we unattractive? Are we boring? Are we socially gauche? Do they think I'm stupid? And I think that it's that those are the most common sources of chronic stress. And now we understand quite a bit about how chronic stress affects the immune system and the cardiovascular system and many other systems important to health. A study in which people, it's a meta-analysis, so it looked at several hundred studies in which people, volunteers, usually students, have been invited into a psychological laboratory and asked to do rather stressful things while having their stress hormones measured. So they were interested in the response of stress hormones to doing stressful tasks. And in this study, this meta-analysis, they were asking what kind of tasks most reliably push up people's levels of cortisol. And their conclusion, after reviewing 208 of those studies, was it's tasks that include social evaluative threat, threats to self-esteem or social status, where others can negatively judge your performance. We don't want to make fools of ourselves in front of other people. It's those kinds of worries. Of course, there are worse sources of stress. Being imprisoned, losing your house or your job. But fortunately, that happens to a smaller proportion of the population. But what I'm talking about, we all know these anxieties. They are the most common source of chronic stress. And we can now also see that in more unequal societies, there are more status anxieties. Along the bottom, you've got different deciles of income. So the poorest tenth of the population is on the left, the richest tenth of the population is on the right. And these different lines are lines of status anxiety at the top, the more unequal countries. So you see there's more anxiety about status, how we've seen and judged, right across all income groups. It's highest amongst the poor, but even amongst the rich. You see those higher levels of status anxiety in the more unequal countries. And the solid line at the bottom is lower levels of status anxiety in the more equal countries. There are two responses to these worries about how you're seen and judged. You know, some people are supremely important, and other people seem as if they're not worth anything at all. And as I say, we all judge each other more by status in a more unequal society. One response is, of course, that you just find social contact too difficult. You withdraw from social life. You suffer from depression, low self-esteem, lack of confidence, all those kinds of issues. But the other is almost the opposite response. If you feel that all the time people are going to judge you by your position in the society, by how rich or poor you look, You put a lot of effort into telling people how well you're doing. You make sure they know that you were promoted very young, that you went to a good university, that you can afford to have holidays the other side of the world. You become narcissistic. This study of self-enhancement, which we could call it self-advertisement or self-aggrandizement, by an international team, they interviewed people in different countries and asked them how they thought they compared with the average in each country. You probably know the joke that about 90% of the population say they're better drivers than average. Here what they were asking people is, do you think you're cleverer than other people in Portugal? Do you think you're more generous? Do you think you're more attractive? That kind of thing. And in more unequal countries, people rate themselves more highly. They do this sort of self-advertisement, self-aggrandizement. And you can see it also drives consumerism. If you live in a more unequal country or American state, you're more likely to spend money on status goods or smart cars and so on. Because money is how we show what we're worth to each other. And you can see as inequality goes up, we borrow more money, we get into debt more, we save less, we go bankrupt more. And indeed, you know, if we're going to reduce consumerism, deal with carbon emissions and so on, we have to reduce the inequality that drives the status competition and intensifies that consumerism. What's happened to income differences in many countries over the course of the 20th century is that income differences started to decline sometime in the 1930s, and they went on down and down and down until sometime in the 1970s, and then you get the modern rise of inequality in the 1980s. That U-shaped distribution of inequality is substantially a reflection first of the rise and then the fall, the strengthening and the weakening of the whole labour movement, of the fear of communism, of the strength of social democratic parties. One indication of the strength of that movement and how it fits this is the proportion of the labour force in trade unions. That top line is the share of income going to the richest 10% in the United States. The bottom blue line is the proportion of the population in trade unions. I've seen this relationship plotted separately for at least half a dozen different countries. It's a general truth that the decline in inequality in the middle decades of the 20th century was driven by, if you like, this countervailing voice, the idea that there was another way of running society, that there were important issues of fairness and so on. And when, of course, all that goes, and social democratic parties lose any idea of what their purpose is, you get the modern rise of inequality. Neoliberalism takes over. In what's happening, of course, the trends in Portugal are better than in some places. I'm not sure what happened in the 1980s and 90s to Portuguese inequality, but at least recently it's been coming down. The main reason why we've all been becoming more unequal is that top incomes have run away from the rest of us. This graph shows you the pay gap between CEOs in the biggest 350 American companies and the average production worker. And you see in, 1975, 1980, the CEOs were getting 30 or 40 times as much as the average production worker. But by the year 2000 and onwards, they were getting 2, 3, or occasionally even 400 times as much. So that top pay just took off. And yet, if you look at it in relation to, I seem to have not got my last slide. You think what the last slide is, anyway, is simply showing you a very recent study quoted in last week's Economist, which looks at the performance of companies in which CEOs are paid more than the average and CEOs who are paid less than the average. Shareholder returns are significantly less in companies where CEOs are paid above the average. They do better where CEOs have not been taking these huge income differences. Yes, this is it. So the red line is the best paid CEOs. Shareholder return are lower where CEOs get most. So it's not about performance. Those pay differences are not justified in terms of productivity or the brilliance of their decisions. The companies with lower paid CEOs are doing better. I shall stop there. Thank you.